In December 2025, Vladimir Putin signed a decree ordering reservists to report for training during the following year. And that was a warning to everybody inside of Russia. It means the war in Ukraine is nowhere near ending. And it means that the state is keeping its machinery to call up more men for the front warm for another year. This order is broader than just the regular army. It covers things like the reservists tied to the Rosguardia, the National Guard, who are used to keep order at home. It covers reservists tied to the Russian Federal Security Service, the domestic service that targets dissent. And in Russia, these reservists are not a small group. It's in fact as many as 20 million men, and they cover a large swath of the society. But they all know that there's something coming their direction, and that is called training. Training is the safe word, the euphemism that the regime uses to prepare for pressure. And at this point, it's updating its records, it's checking who will show up, but it is also getting its units ready to move fast. This builds up extra manpower, who are very handy in settling unrest if it begins to spread within the country. Now, the geography of Russia tells you who's being targeted first. Vladivostok is one of those cities. It's located 6,400 kilometers, 4,000 miles away from the capital. Very far from the capital, with very few connections to it, the people there have very few ways to push back. But that's why there's a problem. Because these people, they don't want to be going to Vladimir Putin's war, and they don't want to be called up as reservists. And that's creating tension. And that tension is something that now is finally reaching back in Moscow. My name is Dr. Jason Smart. I'm a national security advisor and a special correspondent for the Kiev Post who spent 20 years studying the Putin regime. Please subscribe now. Consider becoming a channel member. So let's take a look at what's going on within Russia, because once you understand where these places are, how this all fits together, you'll see why this is something that could very seriously end the Putin regime. So first and foremost, we have to understand that in Russia, things like the military are administered on a local level in many different ways. Things like getting people to join is up to local offices. So if you're a mayor in a small town somewhere watching what you see in Moscow, it sounds very calm from the way they explain things, but you yourself feel abandoned. You realize that this new order is something that's going to cost your area a lot of young men, but also a lot of cash. But imagine if you're a governor, you're facing a trap with two bad doors. If you miss your targets for recruitment, you don't get enough soldiers to sign the dotted line. That means that Moscow will treat you as being disloyal, or they'll simply think that you're incompetent. But in either case, it's not a good thing. But let's imagine that you do meet your target. You get enough soldiers to join the Russian military. Well, that means that your workforce is going to drain, that your tax base is going to drop, and your town is going to all turn on you. The citizens are not happy when their sons are being called off to go to the front, or they're being called off for training. Now, Moscow loves these sorts of terms, these euphemisms like training. Training, it sounds temporary. Students train, athletes train. Training is normal. But when you say to draft people, to mobilize people, that sounds scary. That sounds very permanent. So they use euphemisms, like the euphemism that says that there's 1 year contracts if you join the Russian military, ignoring the fact that Vladimir Putin in 2022, he signed a decree. And that decree said that once you're in the Russian military, you can't get back out until after this special military operation. So anyone who joined in 2022 and is still alive, he's still there. He's not getting away. So today there's a lot of people who are scared of what it means when their young men are being mobilized. What will come next? And at this point, the government has become incredibly efficient in mobilizing these young men. Consider this. They have spent years building up the administrative muscle necessary. They have things like digital registries that reduces the amount of human searches for people who should be in the ranks. They now have electronic notifications to reduce the need for door knocking. But all of these things are working together to get as many bodies into the Russian military as is possible. Now, most of these people will be sent off to do things like to protect critical infrastructure. A man might very well never see a trench inside of Ukraine, but he has already become part of the war machine. Which reminds me, please check out the first pinned comment below with the question of the day and with a really great video you should check out. But right below that, you'll see how you too can help the Ukrainian soldiers get the supplies they need to survive this cold winter and to help Ukraine defeat Russia. Thank you. But a region in Russia looks at this a little bit differently. Though it might never be shelled, though it no way is involved with the war in Ukraine directly, it is still losing men to the state's demands. Now, across Russian history, we've seen how this mechanism works. We saw this in the Soviet period as well. They would typically call up men from the periphery and they would send them off first to the front. But that's something that Russia can't afford to do easily. In fact, it's quite expensive. And Russia has spent incredible sums of money to get people to join the military. But unfortunately for Vladimir Putin, there's not a lot of young men sitting around looking to join the Russian military today. And that's why I have things like today's draft. But to understand why this is destabilizing for the Putin regime, consider this. Russia is not fighting this war evenly across its population. The Kremlin pulls bodies from the poorest, the farthest, the minority heavy republics first, and Moscow stays protected. They're away from the day to day grim war that is occurring. Moscow gets the speeches. The provinces, they get the graves. And just consider the republics of Tuva, Buryatia, and the Altai Republic. These places are thousands of kilometers from the capital, but they have very few jobs open to them. They have very little political leverage, and they are producing the highest killed in action rates of this entire war. The imbalance there is actually quite incredible. Consider Tuva. Its capital of Kizil is about 3,700 kilometers, 2,300 miles from Moscow. Now, that's further than New York to Denver. Or consider Buryatia's capital, Ulan-Ude. That's 4,400 kilometers, 2,700 miles from Moscow. Now, with these sorts of distances, do you think somebody in Moscow knows what's occurring there? They have no idea what's occurring there, which allows the war to perpetuate. As long as people in Moscow don't notice people missing, then there's no war. They don't sense that there's really any significant losses. These are people with whom they have nothing in common, people whom they've never seen. And these people are the ones taking the heavy hits. And because nobody in Moscow pays attention to these regions, this is why Vladimir Putin feels obliged to send them off first. Consider Tuva. For every 10,000 men, 120 are killed. Or in the case of Buryatia, for every 10,000 men, 91 are killed. Or in the Altai Republic, for every 10,000 men, 89 are killed. Moscow, 3 for every 10,000 men. So, in fact, you have a much better chance of dying coming from these regions. In fact, 40 times better chance of dying if you come from Tuva than you do if you come from Moscow. That spreads out the war. Russia has traditionally operated like a colonial force. Russia treats ethnic republics like internal colonies. The center extracts bodies and loyalty, then sends back medals and checks. The republics are expected to supply manpower and not to shape decisions, not to argue with Moscow's thought. The war replays an empire pattern that Russia has never stopped using. Peripheral peoples do the dying, the capital does the deciding. The Kremlin calls it unity, but the reality is that it flows only one way. This is creating, though, a long term problem for Russia. People are starting to ask why their towns are emptying out while Moscow stays normal. And that question does not need a nationalist leader to spread. It spreads due to the inherent grief in the population. Now, money is the bait that usually gets people to join the military. In fact, the federal bonus for joining the military is about $5,200. Now, consider most of Russia, a teacher makes less than $8,000 a year. So if you can make that sort of cash just to join the military, for somebody that's unemployed, that's something that's simply unbelievable. But when you get to a city like Moscow, the capital, they're paying them typically $25,000 as a sign on bonus. Moscow also advertises a first year package of about $68,000. That's more than a teacher or a doctor in Russia would make in many years of working. So when you can make that sort of money quickly, there's an interest in joining. But today, it's not enough. The Russians, despite these incredible money, are not willing to join. They realize it is a path to perdition. And today, though the government has promised things such as injuries being paid for by the government, where you get $40,000 if there's a severe injury, the government's not paying people. The government is trying to do their best to bilk them, to make sure they don't get paid. Now imagine the reservist in Russia. They today are making much less than a soldier in Russia. They would have to work for years to make what a soldier makes. And yet, they never wanted to be a soldier. So that when you mobilize them and they don't get the sign on bonus, they simply get paid the base salary. It's not a very good deal for them. And they're not very happy to see this. So those who joined earlier will get paid well. But those who came later, those who were called up by the government, will get peanuts. This creates tension. This creates tension within the military, and it creates soldiers who don't want to be there. And soldiers who don't want to be there, mixed with those who are making lots of money, are probably not a great combination, especially when you consider that those that are making the most of money are those that typically come from things like a criminal background or drug addicts, others who in the society had no other opportunities. But the ones being called up today are people who had normal jobs, people who might have been working their day job as a doctor or a lawyer, but now they're in the ranks of the Russian military. But going ahead, this is going to create other tensions. And those intentions include things like the fact that people in Moscow are noticing this is happening. And the people in Moscow are noticing this aren't happy about it. Vladimir Putin's support is, in fact, the weakest in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the two cities that historically have been the most important for Russia. If you control Moscow and if you control St. Petersburg, you control the future of Russia. You don't really need the provinces. But in Moscow and St. Petersburg is where we see the strongest opposition to this war. In fact, across Russia, opposition to this war is clearly growing. In polling tied to the Kremlin, about 66% of people favor peace talks. Only about 27% of people favor continuing the war. So, with this sort of lack of support for the war, Vladimir Putin is doing something that's wholly unpopular. And when you do things that are unpopular and you're already sort of an unpopular dictator, that's probably not a great idea. But this leads us to the exact problem that Vladimir Putin most fears. Vladimir Putin knows that he's vulnerable. Today, he's engaged in a war that he cannot afford, a war for which he lacks the soldiers, and a war that now he is drafting common people to come join. People who had normal jobs, people who have families. But more than that, he's drawing the attention of the people in Moscow and the people in St. Petersburg. And as those people see what's occurring, they will undoubtedly become more anti war. Now, it is unlikely that there will be any sort of popular protest in Russia against the war, but what is more likely is look at the history of dictatorships. One of the conditions when dictatorships fall, or when somebody decides to try to overthrow a dictatorship, is when you realize there's going to be base support in the population. It's unwise to overthrow a government if then you yourself will also be overthrown. You have to do it when the population will at least not be closed minded to your new leadership. And it looks like in Russia, there would be support for that. Consider the case of the Wagner Group. When Yevgeny Prigozhin decided to start rolling towards Moscow, he got to the city of Rostov, and what we saw there is probably a sign of what we'd see in larger Russia. When he got to Rostov, the people there, they greeted him as a hero. They brought him food, they brought him wine, they thanked his soldiers, they wanted photos with him, they treated him like a hero. Vladimir Putin was in hiding this entire period of time. But we saw just in that one interaction what the common people really think of the person who's trying to overthrow the Russian government. They were supportive of him. So, Vladimir Putin, when you're tempting fate like this, when you're already going out in a very unpopular war and trying to call up people to do more, and now at this point, even taxing them more, how do you think they will feel about this? As the inflation worsens and it becomes harder to survive inside of Russia, if you're somebody who's already considered ending the Putin regime and creating your own, this would be the very opportune moment to do it. Right now is the moment where you have a military and people in charge of it who are there for training. Those people that are being sent for training don't want to be there. So, what are the chances they would come to the aid and the abetment of the government? And what are the chances? They just decide to sit it out. We know that the Chechens, given the current situation there, with Kadyrov, the father, currently hospitalized with severe problems with his kidneys, and his son Adam, his heir apparent, who is also hospitalized, unable to bring them out to serve. So when you look at all this, there is not a lot of a support network for Vladimir Putin. In fact, today is probably the weakest he has ever been. So despite that the news daily says that things are okay in Russia, nothing could be further from the truth. There is more and more clear evidence that the Putin regime is getting closer to the abyss than you could ever believe. And check out this video if you want to understand exactly why that is. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.